The New Mexico Territory, under the bruised purple of a summer dusk in the 1870s, was a place where dreams went to wither, and only the stubborn survived. The frontier camp, a ragged sprawl of canvas tents and splintered lean-tos, hummed with the low mutter of men's voices, punctuated by the sharp crackle of a central fire that flung shadows across the dusty ground. Ellie Morrow stood at the edge of this rough circle, her scarred face veiled by a tangle of chestnut hair, her thin frame rigid under a weight heavier than the patched dress clinging to her. Shame, forged in years of rejection, had long since burned away her tears, leaving her eyes dry and her heart hollow. This was the hook of her story. A girl traded like a worn-out plow, her value measured in furs and iron, yet standing on the brink of a path she could neither see nor trust. Ellie's father, Jeb Morrow, stood across the fire, his wiry body stooped from a lifetime of scrabbling against barren fields and bad luck. His face, lined and leathery, held no trace of warmth as he spoke to the man who would claim her. "She's sturdy, don't complain none," Jeb said, his voice as flat as the cracked earth under his boots. "Got 5 other mouths to feed, and she ain't no use to me." The words struck Ellie like a lash, each syllable echoing the cruelties of her life in Dusty Hollow. Her stepmother, Lila, had branded her scar at 10, after a barn fire left her cheek puckered and her nose crooked. The townsfolk of that hard-scrabble settlement were no gentler, their whispers cutting deeper than their stares. "No man'll take her, not with that face." Ellie's hands twisted the hem of her dress, her knuckles whitening, as she fixed her gaze on the ground, her chest tight with the familiar ache of being unwanted. The man Jeb addressed was Kael Nashoba, an Apache chief whose presence stilled the camp's rough men like a storm cloud over a prairie. Broad-shouldered and younger than Ellie, had imagined perhaps 30, Kael stood with a quiet authority that needed no bluster. A woven blanket draped one shoulder, its patterns catching the firelight, and his long braids swayed faintly in the evening breeze. A thin scar traced his jaw, a silent story of battles Ellie could only guess at. His dark eyes, steady and unreadable, settled on her, not with the revulsion she'd braced for, but with an intensity that sent a shiver through her. Not fear, but something she couldn't name. He said nothing as Jeb rambled, his silence a heavy thing, like the desert itself holding its breath. Jeb's voice droned on, listing Ellie's supposed virtue strength, her silences if she were livestock at a market. She remembered the times he'd turned away when Lila's taunts grew sharp, or when her brothers, emboldened by their mother's cruelty, pelted her with names like Scarface behind the barn. The preacher in Dusty Hollow, with his talk of beauty as God's favor, had offered only pitying glances, each one a nail in the coffin of her self-worth. Shame coiled in her gut, whispering that this trade was her due, that she was a burden no one could love. Yet Kael's gaze, unwavering and devoid of judgment, unsettled her. It was as if he saw not just her scars, but something beneath them, something she'd long forgotten. When Jeb finished, Kael stepped forward, his boots whispering on the earth. He tossed a bundle of furs, rabbit and deer, soft and well cured to the ground, followed by a pair of iron horseshoes, their clank sealing the deal. The exchange was over, cold and final, like a gate slamming shut on Ellie's past. She braced for what came next, her mind flooded with tales from Dusty Hollow, Apaches stealing women, dragging them into a life of brutality. Her brother's laughter rang in her ears. "Even the savages won't keep you." But Kael defied those stories. He approached her, slow and deliberate, and held out a woven shawl, its intricate designs glowing in the fire's flicker. "For you," he said, his voice low, accented but clear, like water over polished stone. Ellie froze, her fingers trembling as she reached for the shawl. The gesture was so alien kindness without a hidden cost that her breath caught. No one in Dusty Hollow had ever given her anything without expecting gratitude or labor in return. Kael's eyes held hers for a moment, and in them she saw no trace of pity or disgust, only a quiet acknowledgement that she was there, that she mattered. He nodded toward his horse, a sturdy bay tethered nearby, and turned away, leaving her to choose whether to follow. The choice, however small, was a spark in the darkness of her life, a thread of agency she hadn't known she craved. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill of her father's farewell, and followed, her steps hesitant but resolute. As they rode from the camp, Ellie seated behind Kael on the horse, the night closed around them like a curtain. The air was sharp with the scent of sage and dust, the stars above a vast, unyielding map. Her body ached from the jolt of the ride, but her mind was a storm of memory and doubt. She saw Lila's sneer when she spilled flour, her brother's giggles as they mimicked her limp a lingering gift from the fire. The preacher's wife, with her clucking tongue and poor dear sighs, had been no kinder. Shame told her she deserved this fate, that she was a thing to be discarded, a weight on her father's shoulders. Yet Kael's silence wasn't like Jeb's, it wasn't cold or dismissive. It was a presence, steady and unjudging, a puzzle that gnawed at her. They stopped by a dry creek bed, the moon casting a silver sheen over jagged rocks. Kael dismounted with a grace that spoke of years in the saddle and began building a fire, his hands deft with flint and tinder. Ellie slid from the horse, her legs unsteady, and watched him work. She expected demand orders to fetch wood or kneel in submission, as the stories warned. Instead, Kael handed her a strip of dried meat, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The contact was a shock, not because it was harsh, but because it was gentle, a word she'd buried with her mother's memory. She took the meat, her throat tight, and sat by the fire, the shawl soft against her skin. The flames leaped, painting Kael's face in gold and shadow. Ellie studied him, noting the scar on his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the horizon, alert yet calm. He was a man who carried weight not just of leadership, but of something deeper, a story etched in the lines of his face. She wanted to ask why he'd taken her, what he saw in a girl the world had deemed worthless. But fear of his answer or worse, his silence kept her quiet. Instead, she traced the shawl's patterns with her fingers, each stitch a mystery, like the man who'd given it to her. "Why me?" she whispered at last, the words slipping out as the fire popped. Kael didn't answer immediately, only met her eyes, and in that gaze she found no pity, no scorn, only a recognition that she was there, that she was enough. It was a small thing, but it pierced her, planting a seed of curiosity, a faint hope that this man, this stranger, might see her as more than the ugly girl her father had cast off. She thought of her mother, who died when Ellie was 6, brushing her hair and calling her lovely. That memory, buried under years of cruelty, stirred now, fragile but alive. As she lay on the hard ground, the shawl her only shield against the night's chill, Ellie's mind wrestled with the day's upheaval. Shame insisted she was nothing, that Kael's kindness was a mistake, that she'd always be Scar. But his actions, the shawl, the meat, the choice to follow challenged that truth. The fire's warmth reached her, mingling with the desert's vast silence. And for the first time in years, Ellie dared to wonder, could she be more than the girl her father discarded? The shame still burned, a deep and familiar ache, but Kael's quiet care was an ember of something new, hope, tentative and untested, glowing faintly in the dark. The New Mexico Territory's desert sprawled endless under a merciless sun, its red stone cliffs and sagebrush flats, a mirror to the desolation Ellie Morrow carried within. 3 days had passed since her father, Jeb Morrow, traded her to Kael Nashoba, the Apache chief whose quiet kindness had begun to unravel the shame that bound her. Now, riding a small mare Kael had given her, Ellie followed him along a winding trail through canyons and dry riverbeds, her body sore from the saddle, her mind a tempest of doubt and memory. The vast, unforgiving landscape seemed to mock her smallness, yet with each mile, Kael's steady presence chipped away at the belief that she was unlovable, planting fragile seeds of hope she feared to nurture. Ellie gripped the reins, her hands blistered from the unfamiliar task, her scarred cheek burning under the sun's glare. The mare's gait was steady, but the trail was rough, strewn with shale and thorny scrub that snagged her faded dress. Kael rode ahead on his bay, his braids swaying with the rhythm of the horse, his woven blanket folded neatly across his saddle. He spoke little, his silence a stark contrast to the clamor of Dusty Hollow, where her stepmother Lila's taunts, "You'll scare off any man with that face," had filled the air. Yet Kael's quiet wasn't cold. It was a language of small actions, each one a thread pulling Ellie from the darkness of her past. At dawn each day, Kael would hand her a tin cup of boiled coffee, its bitterness sharp but warming. At noon, he'd pause by a cluster of beryl cacti, slicing one open with his knife and offering her the first sip of its pulpy water, his fingers careful not to spill. When her mare shied at a rattlesnake's hiss, Kael steadied it with a low murmur, his hand firm on the rein, his eyes checking her safety before moving on. These gestures, unforced and consistent, were unlike anything Ellie had known. In Dusty Hollow, kindness was a transaction. Lila's rare smiles came with chores, her brother's silence bought with her labor. Kael asked for nothing, and that absence of expectation was both a comfort and a mystery. Her memories haunted her as they rode, rising like dust in the desert wind. She saw her father's disgusted frown when she burned bread, his back turned as Lila called her "Scar" in front of the neighbors. Her brothers, young but cruel, had aped her limpa remnant of the barn fire behind the barn, their laughter cutting deeper than the scars on her face. The townsfolk, with their clucking tongues and whispered pity, had sealed her as an outcast, their sermons about beauty as God's gift, a judgment she could never escape. Shame coiled tight in her chest, insisting that Kael's care was a mistake, that no man, especially a chief respected by his people, could see value in her. She'd catch her reflection in a still pool during a breaker-puckered cheek, her crooked nose, her dull brown eye sand flinch, the old voices roaring, "You're nothing, you'll always be nothing." Yet Kael's gaze told a different story. When he looked at her, his dark eyes held no trace of the disgust she'd braced for. They were steady, searching, as if he saw past her scars to something she'd buried long ago. One afternoon, as they crossed a mesa dotted with yucca, a red-tailed hawk soared overhead, its cry piercing the silence. Kael raised a hand, mimicking the sound, and the bird circled closer, answering. He smiled a rare, fleeting curve of his lips and turned to Ellie. "It knows you now," he said, his voice low and warm. The words, simple but deliberate, struck her like a spark, igniting a warmth she hadn't felt since her mother's death, when she was 6 and the world still held kindness. That evening, they camped by a narrow creek, its water glinting under a crimson sunset that painted the canyon walls in fire. Kael knelt to build a fire, his hands deft with flint and tinder, the scar on his jaw catching the light. Ellie sat clutching the shawl he'd given her, its woven patterns now a familiar comfort under her fingers. She wanted to ask why he treated her this way, why he offered coffee, water, safety, without demanding her gratitude, but fear of his answer held her tongue. What if he pitied her? What if this was all a prelude to some unspoken debt? Instead, she watched him work, noting the way his shoulders tensed at a distant coyote's howl, the way his movements were both precise and unhurried, like the desert itself. As the fire crackled, Kael pointed to the sky, tracing a constellation with his finger. "Di Wei Shuong Yi," he said, naming it in Apache, then adding in English, "It guides us home." His voice was a melody, soft but sure, and the word home landed like a stone in Ellie's chest. Home was Lila's sneers, Jeb's indifference, a place where she'd never belonged. Yet Kael's tone made it feel possible, a dream she hadn't dared entertain. He handed her a piece of roasted corn, its husk charred but warm, and when their fingers brushed, she didn't pull away. The contact was a quiet shock, a reminder that gentleness existed, that it could be for her. The trail tested her in ways Dusty Hollow never had. Her hands blistered, her legs cramped from hours in the saddle, her throat parched despite Kael's lessons on finding water. Yet with each day, she felt a shift, subtle but real. The desert, harsh and wild, didn't care about her scars or her past. It demanded only survival, and Kael's teaching show to spot a snake's tracks, how to tie a knot that held fast gave her a purpose she'd never known. When she managed to secure a saddlebag without his help, he nodded, his eyes glinting with something like pride. "Good," he said, and the single word was a balm, soothing the wounds of a lifetime of dismissal. One morning, as they rode through a canyon where the walls glowed pink in the dawn, Kael paused by a patch of desert marigolds, their yellow petals defiant against the sand. He plucked one and handed it to her, his fingers careful not to crush it. "For strength," he said, and Ellie took it, her throat tight. She tucked the flower into her shawl, its brightness a contrast to the gray of her dress. The gesture was small, but it challenged the shame that clung to her, whispering that she was worthless. Kael's actions said otherwise, and each one was a brick in a foundation of hope she was only beginning to trust. That night, by the creek, Ellie found the courage to speak. "Why don't you send me back?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the water's murmur. Kael looked at her, firelight dancing in his eyes, his scar, a shadow on his jaw. "You are not a thing to be sent," he said, his words slow and deliberate. The truth in them struck deep, cutting through the lies of Dusty Hollow. She wasn't a burden, a mistake, a scar. She was Ellie, and for the first time, someone saw her as enough. As she lay under the stars, the shawl soft against her skin, Ellie felt the shame loosen, like a knot slowly untying. The desert's silence wrapped around her, mingling with the fire's glow, and Kael's presence, steady, unyielding, was a beacon in the dark. She thought of her mother, who'd once called her beautiful, a memory nearly lost under years of cruelty. Now, with Kael's quiet adoration, that memory stirred, fragile but growing. Shame still whispered, but hope was louder, a promise that she might find a place, a person, who valued her not for what she lacked, but for who she was. The canyon walls of the New Mexico territory rose like ancient guardians, their red stones streaked with shadow as the late summer sun dipped low. Ellie Morrow, her scarred face flushed from days on the trail, stood at the edge of an Apache village, her heart a tangle of hope and fear. The air was thick with the scent of sage and roasting maize, and the hum of life children's laughter, the rhythmic grind of corn, the soft thud of hooves filled the space between adobe home. Kael Nashoba, the chief who'd taken her from her father's trade, led her forward, his presence a steady anchor. Yet the villagers' stares pierced Ellie's fragile confidence, reviving the shame of Dusty Hollow, where she'd been Scar, the girl no one wanted. In this new world, hope flickered, but the weight of being an outsider threatened to snuff it out. Kael walked with a calm purpose, his braids swaying, his woven blanket now tied at his waist. The village, nestled in a canyon bend, was alive with movement. Women knelt by metates, grinding corn into fine meal. Men repaired bows and sharpened knives. Children darted between homes, their eyes bright with curiosity. Ellie clutched the shawl Kael had given her, its patterns a lifeline against the scrutiny. Her faded dress, patched and dusty, marked her as foreign, and her scar-puckered cheek, crooked nose felt like a brand under the villagers' gazes. She remembered her stepmother Lila's words, "No one'll want you, not even the savages." The memory clawed at her, whispering that she didn't belong here, that Kael's kindness was a fluke. They approached a small adobe home, its door framed with dried herbs. Mina, Kael's aunt, emerged, her face weathered but warm, her eyes crinkling with a kindness that reminded Ellie of her mother, long gone. "Welcome, child," Mina said, her English halting but sincere, taking Ellie's hand. The touch was soft, unjudging, and Ellie's throat tightened. "You are not what they named you," Mina added, as if reading the shame in Ellie's hunched shoulders. The words were a balm, easing the ache of years spent as Scar. Mina led her to a communal fire, where women worked, and handed her a grinding stone. Ellie hesitated, her hands clumsy, but Mina's patient nod urged her on. She knelt, mimicking the women's motions, the stone's weight grounding her. The rhythm of grinding corn steadied her pulse, and for the first time since childhood, she felt useful, not pitied. Not all were welcoming. Torin, a young Apache rider with sharp eyes and a cocky grin, leaned against a nearby wall, his bow slung low across his back. His gaze flicked over Ellie's scars, his lips curling in a smirk. "Kael's burden," he muttered to a friend, loud enough for her to hear. The word burden echoed Jeb's dismissal, Lila's sneers, and shame surged, hot and familiar. Ellie's hands faltered, the stone slipping, and her shoulders slumped, the old instinct to hide taking hold. She expected Kael to ignore it, as her family always had when her brothers taunted her. But Kael stepped forward, his voice low and sharp, speaking in Apache. Torin's smirk vanished, his face reddening as he muttered something and walked away. Kael's defense, quiet but firm, sent a warmth through Ellie's chest, a hope that she might be worth protecting, worth keeping. Mina guided her to a group of women weaving reeds into baskets, their fingers deft and sure. Ellie sat among them, her own hands awkward, the reeds slipping from her grasp. Mina corrected her gently, showing her how to twist the strands, and the women's soft chattersome in Apache, some in broken English, wrapped around her like a blanket. One woman, her hair streaked with gray, noticed Ellie's shawl and smiled. "Kael chose well for you," she said, her voice kind. The comment, simple but earnest, made Ellie's eyes sting. She glanced at Kael, who sat nearby sharpening a knife, his eyes catching hers briefly. His nod, small but deliberate, felt like a promise, anchoring her in this unfamiliar place. As dusk settled, the village gathered around a central fire, its glow pushing back the canyon's shadows. Stories were told in Apache, their cadence soothing even if Ellie understood little. Mina sat beside her, translating a tale of a girl lost in the desert, guided home by the stars. The story struck a chord, reminding Ellie of her mother's bedtime tales before the fire that scarred her face and stole her family's love. Shame whispered that she'd never be that girl again, that she was too broken to belong. But Mina's hand on her shoulder, warm and steady, silenced it. "You learn fast," Kael said later, as they walked to her sleeping mat, his voice low but approving. The words, rare and unadorned, lit a spark of pride she hadn't felt since she was a child, helping her mother knead dough. The next morning, Ellie joined the women to carry water from a spring, her arms aching under the weight of clay jugs. The task was hard, her steps unsteady on the rocky path. But the women's encouragement nods, a quiet, "good," from one kept her going. Torin passed by, his gaze less hostile, and though he didn't speak, his silence felt like a truce. Ellie realized the village wasn't her enemy, only a mirror of her own fears. A child, no older than 6, ran up, her braids bouncing, and offered Ellie a clay bead, its blue glaze catching the light. "It matches your eyes," the girl said shyly. Ellie's breath caught, her hand trembling as she took it. She strung the bead onto a cord, tying it around her wrist, a small act of claiming her place. The gesture was a crack in the wall of shame, letting hope seep through. That afternoon, Ellie helped Mina prepare a stew, chopping wild onions with a knife that felt too large in her hand. Mina's stories of her youth, of Kael's father, a chief who'd taught him honor, filled the air, and Ellie listened, hungry for connection. When she cut the onions evenly, Mina smiled, saying, "You have strong hands." The praise, untainted by pity, was a gift, and Ellie's chest swelled with a feeling she barely recognized, belonging. She glanced at Kael, who was repairing a child's toy bow nearby, his focus intent, but his posture relaxed. He looked up, meeting her eyes, and his slight smile was a spark, warming her more than the fire. As night fell, Ellie lay on her mat under the stars, the village's sound-soft voices, a distant lullaby blending with the canyon's quiet. The shawl, now smelling of sage and smoke, was her shield against the night's chill. Shame still lingered, a fear that acceptance could vanish, that Torin's taunts, or the villagers' stares, might return. But Mina's warmth, the child's bead, and Kael's steady presence were stronger, weaving a new truth. She wasn't Scar here. She was Ellie, learning, growing, seen. The hope that had flickered on the trail now burned brighter, tempered by the lingering doubt that belonging was too good to last. Yet as she traced the bead on her wrist, its cool surface grounding her, Ellie felt a shift. Kael's adoration, quiet but unwavering, was teaching her that worth wasn't something others gave it, was something she could claim. The New Mexico Territory's sun blazed at its zenith, turning the riverbank into a furnace of glinting water and scorched earth. Ellie Morrow, her scarred face now tanned from weeks with Kael Nashoba, froze at the sight of a settler's wagon, its canvas torn and blood-streaked, a dead horse sprawled beside it. The hope Kael's quiet kindness had kindled a belief that she could be more than Scar, the rejected girl of Dusty Hollow, felt fragile here, where violence had left its mark. Kael, ever calm, dismounted to investigate, his knife drawn but his posture cautious. The discovery of Sarah Boone, a battered settler clutching a knife, thrust Ellie into a storm of shame and betrayal, testing the redemption she'd begun to embrace. The wagon's wreckage told a grim story. Splintered wheels, scattered pots, a child's rag doll half buried in the dirt. Ellie's stomach churned, her mind flashing to tales from Dusty Hollow of Apache raids, stories that painted men like Kael as monsters. Yet the man beside her, his braids catching the sun, moved with care, scanning the scene for signs of life. Sarah emerged from behind the wagon, her blonde hair matted with blood, her blue eyes wild with terror. "Stay back, savage," she screamed, brandishing a knife at Kael. Ellie stepped forward, hands raised, her voice soft but firm. "He won't hurt you," she said, meeting Sarah's gaze. The woman's eyes flicked to Ellie's scars, then back to Kael, confusion twisting her features. "You're with him?" she spat, as if Ellie had betrayed her own kind. The accusation stung, slicing open old wounds from Dusty Hollow, where townsfolk whispered that she was less than human, her face a curse. Shame flooded Ellie, whispering that she was a traitor, that her trust in Kael was a sin. She pushed it down, helping Kael guide Sarah to a shaded spot by the river, where willows drooped low. Kael knelt, his movements precise, soaking a cloth in the river to clean Sarah's gashed arm. He tore strips from his own shirt to bind her wounds, his hands steady despite her flinches and muttered curses. Ellie watched, marveling at his patience, so unlike her father Jeb's cold indifference or Lila's sharp cruelty. She coaxed Sarah into drinking from a canteen, her own hands steady despite the woman's distrust. "He saved you," Ellie said, but Sarah's eyes narrowed, her voice a hiss. "You're lost, girl, staying with a man like that." Ver. The words echoed Lila's taunts, the preacher's sermons about heathens, and Ellie's shame roared, a voice insisting she was wrong to trust Kael, to feel hope in his presence. She glanced at him, rinsing blood from his hands in the river, his face calm but kind. Her heart ached with a truth she couldn't voice. Kael's care was the first she'd known since her mother died, when she was 6 and the world still seemed safe. As they built a fire to camp, Sarah's fear eased, but her prejudice lingered. She accepted Kael's roasted rabbit, her fingers trembling, but avoided his gaze, her silence, a betrayal of the man who'd risked his life for her. Ellie's chest tightened, the sting of Sarah's judgment mingling with memories of her brother's laughter, her neighbor's pity. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Ellie sat apart, her shawl pulled tight against the river's chill. Sarah's words churned in her mind, stirring doubts she'd thought she'd buried. Was she betraying her people by trusting Kael? Was she foolish to believe his kindness meant she was worth something? Shame whispered that she was nothing, that Kael's care was pity, that her scars made her a fool for hoping. She thought of Dusty Hollow's church, where the preacher's wife had offered her a worn dress with a look that said, "Poor thing." The memory burned, but Kael's action, she's steady hands, his quiet respect were a counterpoint, a light in the dark. He approached, offering a blanket, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that silenced her fears. "She does not see," he said, nodding toward Sarah. "But you do." His words, simple but sure, rekindled her hope, a flame against the chill of betrayal. The next morning, they moved toward a safer trail, Sarah limping between them, her arm bandaged, but her suspicion sharp. Ellie noticed Kael's small axe, adjusting Sarah's bandage when it slipped, guiding her over rocks with a gentle hand. Sarah's tension softened, but she still whispered to Ellie during a break, her voice low and urgent. "You don't know what they've done, what they're capable of." Ellie's patience snapped, her voice rising. "I know what people do when they judge," she said, her eyes fierce. "He's done more for you than my own kin ever did for me." Sarah looked away, her face flushing, and Ellie felt a surge of strength. She wasn't the girl who cowered anymore. Kael's adoration had taught her to stand tall, to speak her truth. As they camped again, Ellie helped Kael set traps for game, their movements falling into a quiet rhythm. He showed her how to spot edible roots, kneeling to dig one up, his voice low and steady as he explained its uses. When Ellie unearthed one correctly, her fingers muddy but sure, he smiled, a rare curve of his lips that made her heart race. "You learn well," he said, and the praise, free of condescension, was a gift. Ellie realized that hope wasn't just surviving, it was thriving in a world that saw her worth. Sarah's betrayal, though painful, couldn't dim that light. She was beginning to see herself as Kael did, not as Scar, but as Ellie, capable and whole. The river's murmur filled the evening, blending with the fire's crackle. Ellie sat closer to Kael, the shawl soft against her shoulders, the blanket he'd given her draped over her knees. Sarah slept nearby, her breathing uneven, her prejudice a wall Ellie couldn't breach. Yet Kael's presence was a bridge, connecting her to a future she was only beginning to imagine. He pointed to a plant by the river, its leaves silver in the moonlight, and named it in Apache, then English. "For healing." Ellie nodded, memorizing it, her fingers brushing the marigold tucked into her shawl from days before. The small acts of teaching, of sharing, were building something in her, a foundation of hope that shame couldn't topple. As she lay under the stars, the blanket warm against her, Ellie felt the weight of Sarah's words linger, a reminder of the world she'd left behind. Shame still whispered that she was a traitor, that her scars made her unworthy of Kael's care. But betrayal's sting, Sarah's, dusty hollow was fading, overshadowed by Kael's unwavering respect. She thought of her mother, who'd once sung her to sleep, her voice a promise of love. That promise, buried under years of rejection, was stirring now, fed by Kael's quiet adoration. Ellie traced the marigold's petals, its fragility a mirror to her own, and knew she'd chosen her side not out of defiance, but out of a growing belief that she deserved to be seen, to be loved. The New Mexico Territory's prairie stretched flat and unforgiving, the cavalry outpost a jagged scar of wooden palisades and canvas tents against the late summer sky. Ellie Morrow, her scarred face dust-streaked from the trail, walked beside Kael Nashoba and Sarah Boone, her heart pounding like a war drum. The hope Kael's quiet adoration had nurtured a belief that she could be more than Scar, the outcast of Dusty Hollow now faced a crucible. The outpost, with its promise of civilization, reeked of the world that had rejected her, and its hostility toward Kael stirred a fury that burned through her shame. Sarah's silence and the soldiers' contempt were betrayals that tested Ellie's redemption, pushing her to fight for the man who'd seen her worth. The outpost buzzed with the clamor of military life. Soldiers polished rifles, horses snorted in corrals, and a bugle's wail cut through the air heavy with tobacco and sweat. Sarah, her arm bandaged from Kael's care, was met with gasps and hurried hands, whisked to a medic's tent like a lost lamb. But Kael's presence drew cold stares, his braids and woven blanket marking him as other. Ellie felt the weight of eyes on her patched dress, her puckered cheek, her crooked nose reviving the shame of Dusty Hollow, where townsfolk had whispered she was less than human. Captain Holt, a grizzled officer with a whiskey-reddened nose and deep lines around his mouth, stepped forward, his hand on his pistol. "Step back, Apache," he barked before Kael could speak. Ellie's stomach twisted, her hands clenching the shawl Kael had given her. She stepped between them, her voice trembling but clear. "He's with us. He saved her life. Holt's eyes flicked to her scars, his lip curling in a sneer that echoed her stepmother Lila's disgust. "You're confused, miss," he said, his tone dismissive, as if she were a child lost in a fever dream. The words stung, slicing open wounds from her past Jeb's indifference, Lila's taunts, the preacher's pitying sermons. Shame roared, whispering that she was nothing, that her defense of Kael was foolish, that she belonged in the world that had cast her out. She glanced at Sarah, hoping for support, but Sarah's eyes dropped, her silence a knife sharper than Holt's scorn. Kael stood tall, his hands raised, his face calm despite the rifles now aimed at his chest. "Take the woman," he said, nodding toward Sarah, his voice steady. "I mean no harm." His selflessness, even in the face of hatred, deepened Ellie's resolve. She wouldn't let this world, her father's world, Dusty Hollow's world, steal the man who'd given her hope, who'd taught her she was worth seeing. "He's not a criminal," she shouted, her voice rising over the outpost's din. "He saved us both." The soldiers paused, startled by her ferocity, but Holt waved them on, his sneer unwavering. "Get him to the holding tent," he ordered, and 2 men seized Kael, binding his wrists with rope. A soldier grabbed Ellie's arm, his grip firm but not cruel. "We'll get you home, miss," he said, his tone meant to soothe. The word home was a chain, dragging her back to Jeb's sneers, Lila's cruelty, a life of being scar. Ellie wrenched free, her eyes blazing. "This isn't my home," she snapped, her voice carrying a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The soldier flinched, but Holt's cold laugh cut through. "Deluded girl," he muttered, turning away. The betrayal, Sarah's silence, Holt's dismissal, the outpost's blind prejudice burned in Ellie's chest, mingling with the shame of being seen as less than human. Yet Kael's calm, even as he was led away, was a beacon, urging her to fight. As dusk settled, the outpost grew quieter, its lanterns casting long shadows across the dirt. Ellie sat by a fire pit, the shawl tight around her shoulders, Sarah nearby sipping tea from a tin cup, her face bandaged and clean. "Say something," Ellie pleaded, her voice breaking. "Tell them what he did for you." Sarah's eyes darted away, her voice low and hesitant. "It's better this way," she said. "You're safe now." The betrayal cut deeper than any insult, echoing her brother's laughter, her neighbor's whispers. "You were never in danger," Ellie whispered, standing and walking into the twilight, her heart set on Kael. She wouldn't let him be caged for his kindness, not by a world that refused to see his worth or hers. Ellie's mind raced as she moved through the outpost, her boots silent on the packed earth. She remembered Kael's hands, steady as he bound Sarah's wounds, his eyes warm as he taught her to find water on the trail. Shame told her she was a fool, that she'd be caught, branded a traitor for defying her people. But the hope Kael had kindled a belief that she was enough, scars and all, was stronger. She crept toward the holding tent, its canvas flapping in the breeze, and peered inside. Kael knelt, wrists bound, his face bruised but unbroken, his dark eyes meeting hers with a trust that made her throat tighten. "I'm sorry," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. "I shouldn't have brought you here." Kael shook his head, his voice soft. "You needed to see." His words pierced her, revealing a truth she'd half known. This outpost, with its order and safety, was a cage, a mirror of the life she'd escaped. The world that had rejected her, Jeb, Lila, Dusty Hollow, wanted to mold her back into something small, quiet, grateful for scraps of pity. Kael's calm strength, even bound, was a call to action, a reminder of the woman she was becoming. Ellie's fingers brushed his, a silent vow, and she stood, her heart racing but her purpose clear. She'd seen a storage shed earlier, its door ajar, likely holding tools. If she could free Kael, they could escape this place, this world, and build something new. The night was still, the outpost's men lulled by routine, their laughter drifting from a mess tent. Ellie moved through shadows, her shawl blending with the dark, her steps light but determined. She remembered the trail, where Kael had given her a marigold for strength, where his quiet lessons had taught her to trust herself. Shame lingered, a fear that the world would always see her as Scar, as a traitor for choosing Kael. But Sarah's betrayal, Holt's contempt, only fueled her resolve. This wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about proving herself right, about claiming the life Kael's adoration had shown her she deserved. The shed loomed ahead, its wooden walls weathered, its door creaking as she slipped inside. Moonlight revealed a rusted knife, a coil of rope, and a pair of bolt cutters, left carelessly by some quartermaster. Ellie tucked them under her shawl, her hands steady despite the risk. She wasn't the girl who'd cowered in Dusty Hollow, who'd swallowed her voice to avoid Lila's wrath. Kael had seen her strength, her worth, and now she'd see herself. As she moved back toward the holding tent, the stars above seemed to watch, their light a reminder of the trail, where hope had taken root. She'd free Kael, not just from ropes, but from a world that refused to see his humanity. And in doing so, she'd free herself from the shame that had bound her for too long. The New Mexico Territory's night was a velvet shroud, the cavalry outpost's lanterns dimming as Ellie Morrow crept through its shadows, her heart a wild pulse of fear and defiance. The air carried the sharp tang of pine and gunpowder, a reminder of the world she was rejecting. Her scarred face, once a mark of shame, now felt like a badge of her resolve as she clutched a rusted knife and bolt cutters stolen from a shed, determined to free Kael Nashoba. The hope Kael's quiet adoration had kindled that she could be more than Scar, the unwanted girl of Dusty Hollow, was now afire, burning away the betrayal of Sarah Boone and Captain Holt. This escape was not just a rescue, it was Ellie claiming her life, her worth, her love. The outpost slept uneasily, its guards dozing with rifles slack in their arms, their snores mingling with the distant whinny of horses. Ellie's boots were silent on the packed dirt, her shawl blending with the dark as she moved toward the holding tent where Kael was bound. Shame whispered that she was a fool, that she'd be caught, branded a traitor for defying the world that claimed to be hers. She saw her father Jeb's cold eyes, trading her for pelts, Sarah's averted gaze, refusing to defend Kael, Holt's sneer, dismissing her as deluded. The betrayal stung, but Kael's face bruised but calm, his eyes trusting when she'd knelt beside him, silenced her doubts. His words, "You needed to see," echoed, urging her to reject the outpost's false promises for the freedom they'd found together. Ellie reached the shed first, its door still ajar from her earlier theft. She slipped inside, the moonlight revealing the tools she'd hidden under her shawl. A knife, its blade dull but sharp enough, and bolt cutters, heavy but promising. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of her choice. She wasn't the girl who'd cowered in Dusty Hollow, swallowing her voice to avoid Lila's wrath. Kael's care, his shawl, his teachings, his steady Gaza had shown her she was worth fighting for. She tucked the tools closer, her resolve hardening like the canyon stone she'd come to know on the trail. The holding tent loomed ahead, its canvas flapping in a faint breeze. Ellie crouched, scanning for movement. A guard leaned against a post, his head lolling, a bottle of whiskey at his feet. She waited, her breath shallow, until his snores deepened, then slipped inside. Kael knelt in the dark, wrists bound with coarse rope, his face shadowed but his eyes alert. They met hers, and in them she saw trust, pride, a spark that made her heart stutter. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice low, and the sound of her name, untainted by pity, was a lifeline. She knelt beside him, the knife trembling in her hand as she cut the ropes, her fingers brushing his bruised wrists. "If we run, they follow," Kael warned, his tone calm but urgent. Ellie shook her head, her voice fierce despite its whisper. "Then let them. We'll show them what strength looks like." Kael's gaze softened, a rare smile touching his lips, and in that moment they were partners, bound by more than circumstance. She snapped the last rope with the bolt cutters, the metals groaned loud in the silence. Kael stood, his movements stiff but sure, and together they slipped out, keeping to the shadows of the tent line. Ellie's heart raced, her senses sharp, the creak of a distant gate, the rustle of sagebrush, the stars above like silent witnesses. She led the way, her smaller frame darting ahead to clear branches, Kael close behind, his presence a steady rhythm at her back. They moved toward the tree line, the outpost's glow fading behind them. Ellie's mind flashed to the trail, where Kael had given her a marigold for strength, where his quiet lessons had taught her to trust her own hands. Now, those hands guided them, pushing aside thorns, finding the path Kael had whispered, about a ravine the cavalry feared, its stone walls a sanctuary. As they ran, Kael shared a story, his voice low to keep their pace. "My brother loved a settler," he said, his words heavy with loss. "He defied our elders, and they shunned him. He broke, because no one stood for him." Ellie grabbed his hand, her fingers tight. "I'm standing for you," she said, her voice firm, and Kael's grip tightened, a silent vow. Dawn broke as they reached the ravine, its towering walls casting long shadows over a narrow path. Ellie collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged, not from exhaustion but from the weight of what she'd left behind. The outpost, with its promise of safety, was a lie, a cage like Dusty Hollow, where she'd been Scar, the girl no one wanted. "They'll call me a traitor," she murmured, shame creeping in, a fear that the world would never see her as anything else. Kael crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her scarred cheek, his touch gentle but sure. "Only those afraid of truth use that word," he said, his eyes holding hers. The words, like his care, were a balm, rekindling the hope that had grown from a spark to a flame. They pressed deeper into the ravine, finding a hidden clearing by a crystal stream, where Mina, Kael's aunt, waited. Her weathered face lit with warmth, as if she'd known they'd come. "You were found," she said to Ellie, offering a bowl of stew, its steam rising in the cool air. The words sank deep. Healing wounds left by Jeb's rejection, Lila's cruelty, Sarah's silence. Ellie helped set up camp, her hands learning Mina's knots, tying reeds to secure a lean-to. Her movements were surer now, her body stronger from the trail, her heart lighter. Kael watched, his eyes proud, and when he handed her a carved wooden bead, saying, "For courage," Ellie felt a rush of love, not just for him, but for the woman she was becoming. As dusk fell, they sat by a small fire, Mina singing an Apache lullaby, its melody weaving through the ravine's quiet. Ellie leaned against Kael, her shawl blending with his blanket, their warmth shared. The stew's sage and corn filled her senses, grounding her in this moment, this place. Shame lingered, a whisper that the cavalry might come, that the world would brand her an outcast. But Sarah's betrayal, Holt's contempt, were fading, their power dimmed by Mina's acceptance and Kael's steadfastness. Ellie traced the bead in her hand, its smooth surface a reminder of her choice. She wasn't running from the world, she was running toward herself, toward a life where she was seen, valued, loved. The stars emerged, bright against the canyon's dark, and Ellie felt a shift, as if the desert itself was holding her. She thought of her mother, whose songs had once promised safety, a promise broken by fire and cruelty. Kael's presence was a new promise, one she trusted, not out of naivety, but out of the strength she'd found in his care. Mina's lullaby faded, and Kael's hand rested on hers, his touch a quiet anchor. "We are free," he said, his voice soft but certain. Ellie nodded, her throat tight, the hope in her chest no longer fragile but fierce. She'd chosen Kael, chosen herself, and in the ravine's embrace, she knew she'd never go back to the world that had tried to break her. The hidden canyon clearing, tucked deep in the New Mexico territory, was a sanctuary of wildflowers and whispering streams, its air sweet with pine and late spring warmth. Months had passed since Ellie Morrow and Kael Nashoba escaped the cavalry outpost, and the life they'd built with Mina, Kael's aunt, was a testament to the hope Kael's adoration had ignited. Ellie's scarred face, once a source of shame, now glowed with sunburned strength, her hands calloused from planting corn and weaving nets. But when Captain Holt's patrol found them, with Sarah Boone among them, Ellie faced a final test of her redemption, a stand to prove her worth to a world that had never seen Itan to herself. The clearing was alive with the rhythm of their days, corn sprouting in neat rows, fishnets drying by the stream, a small fire sending curls of smoke into the dawn. Ellie, stronger now, moved with a confidence she'd never known in Dusty Hollow, where she'd been Scar, the girl no one wanted. She laughed freely, her voice ringing when she tripped over a root, and Kael's rare grin answered, his braids catching the light. Their love was unspoken but deep, woven into shared task-stending crops, mending trap-sand quiet touches that needed no words. Ellie caught her reflection in the stream one morning, her cheeks flushed, her hair wild, her eyes bright. She didn't flinch. She saw not Scar, but Ellie, whole and fierce, a woman Kael saw as beautiful. Mina's wisdom had shaped her too. The old woman taught her to track elk, read the wind's shifts, and heal with herbs, each lesson a step toward belonging. Ellie's hands, once clumsy, now crushed sage with precision, her fingers stained with the earth's colors. Shame was a faint echo, drowned by Kael's pride and Mina's gentle nods. But peace, Ellie had learned, was fragile in a world built on judgment. She spotted the patrol at dawn, 5 riders cresting the ridge above the clearing, their rifles glinting. Her heart lurched as she recognized Holt's grim face, and Sarah, her arm in a sling, her expression tight. Ellie ran to the fire, where Kael and Mina sorted herbs, her voice sharp with urgency. They found us. 5 riders, maybe more behind them. Vet. Kael stood, his calm masking a weary readiness, as if he'd known this day would come. Mina's eyes narrowed, but she moved with quiet purpose, gathering supplies. Hide in the stone nest, Kael told them, pointing to a sheltered cave in the canyon wall. Ellie grabbed his arm, her eyes blazing. I'm not leaving you. If they take you, they'll have to take me too. Kael's face softened, pain flickering in his dark eyes, but her resolve was iron. You should not die for me, he said, his voice low. Ellie's voice was fierce, unwavering. I'm not dying for you. I'm living for what you taught me. His hand brushed hers, a silent agreement, and they prepared to face the riders together. The confrontation unfolded as the sun struck the clearing, gilding the grass and wildflowers. Holt dismounted, his rifle raised, his face carved with contempt. Sarah stood behind him, her voice weak but pleading. Let the girl go. We can still help her. Ellie stepped forward, arms raised, her shawl slipping to her shoulders, her scarred face unhidden. He's not your prisoner, she said, her voice ringing like a bell. He's my husband. The word, unvoiced until now, was a truth as raw and sacred as the land itself. Kael moved beside her, his presence a mountain, his hand grazing hers. The soldiers froze, their rifles wavering, and Holt's eyes narrowed, caught off guard by her defiance. You don't decide who I belong to, Ellie continued, her voice breaking but firm, each word a hammer against the shame of her past. My father gave me away because I was ugly. Kael gave me back my life because he saw more than a face. She thought of Jeb's cold dismissal, Lila's cruel taunts, the townsfolk's pity that had caged her. Sarah's eyes dropped, shame flushing her cheeks, and Ellie felt the sting of her betrayal, her silence at the outpost, her refusal to see Kael's humanity. But Kael's steady warmth at her side was stronger, a reminder of the hope he'd nurtured, the belief that she was enough. Holt's mouth twitched, his fury barely contained. You're a fool, girl, he spat, raising his rifle higher. But a young soldier, his face boyish under his hat, spoke up, his voice hesitant. Let them be, sir. They ain't hurting anyone. The words hung in the air, a crack in the outpost's armor. Another soldier nodded, his rifle lowering, and Holt's jaw tightened, his authority fraying. Sarah looked away, her hands trembling, and Ellie knew she'd lost the woman she'd tried to save. The betrayal cut, but it was a shallow wound compared to the strength she'd found. Holt spat on the ground, his voice a growl. This ain't over. He turned his horse, the patrol following, their hoofbeats fading into the canyon's echo. Ellie held Kael's hand, her breath steady as the dust settled, her heart pounding with triumph. They'd won, not with violence, but with love's defiance, a stand that felt like a rebirth. She turned to Kael, her fingers tightening around his, and saw pride in his eyes, a mirror to her own. Mina emerged from the stone nest, her smile soft but knowing, and together they returned to the fire, the clearing untouched by the patrol's threat. Seasons turned, and Ellie shed the last fragments of the girl she'd been. She and Kael planted corn, their hands working the earth in unison, their laughter mingling with the stream's song. Mina's death, peaceful under winter stars, left a quiet ache, but her lessons lived in Ellie's skillshable poultices, fishnets, tracking paths through the canyon. Travelers came, Apache kin and traders, whispering of the couple who'd defied the cavalry, their story a legend not of scandal but of courage. Ellie marked Jeb's death, news brought by a passing merchant, with wildflowers by the stream not for him, but for the girl she'd outgrown, the one he'd tried to break. One evening, as summer bloomed again, Ellie and Kael sat by the fire, the canyon alive with crickets and starlight. She touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw, her touch reverent. They'd never spoken of marriage, but their bond was deeper, forged in shared silences and mutual strength. Kael wrapped her in the blanket they now shared, the one he'd offered on the trail, and whispered, "No one will give you away again." Ellie leaned into him, her eyes closing, a smile curving her lips. The shame of Dusty Hollow Jeb's rejection, Lila's cruelty, Sarah's betrayal was gone, replaced by a redemption that felt like home. Ellie caught her reflection in the stream one dawn, her face weathered but strong, her scars a map of her journey. She didn't look away. She saw defiance, love, a beauty the world of Dusty Hollow could never understand. The canyon, with its wildflowers and steady stream, was her mirror now, reflecting a woman who'd claimed her worth. Kael's adoration had crafted a love story, not just between them, but within her a story of a girl who'd been called ugly and found she was enough. As she planted seeds beside Kael, their hands brushing, Ellie knew this was her truth. Love, unconditional and rare, was hers, and she'd hold it forever. As the New Mexico sun dipped below the canyon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Ellie Morrow stood beside Kael Nashoba, their hands entwined, the wildflowers around their clearing swaying in the breeze. Her scars, once a mark of shame, were now a testament to a journey from rejection to redemption. Kael's quiet adoration had transformed her, not by erasing her past, but by showing her that love sees beyond the surface, finding worth in the heart's truth. Their story, born in the harsh deserts and defiant stands, was a beacon of hope, a reminder that love, when unconditional, can heal even the deepest wounds. The lesson of Ellie and Kael's tale is profound. True worth is not defined by others' judgments, but by the courage to claim your own value. In a world quick to label and discard, their love taught us to look deeper, to stand for those who are unseen, and to build a life rooted in mutual respect. Ellie's transformation from a girl called Scar to a woman who bloomed in the wild urges us to shed our own fears and embrace the love we deserve, no matter the odds. Let their story linger in your heart. Subscribe to Wild West Love Tales to hear more stories of passion and perseverance that echo through the ages. In the comments, drop the number 8, a symbol of eternal love, to honor Ellie and Kael's unbreakable bond. Share how their journey inspires you, because love, like theirs, is a legacy worth celebrating.